King Henry IV of England was not remembered by his contemporaries as a gentle ruler. He came to power through force, deposition, and bloodshed, seizing the crown in 1399 after overthrowing Richard II. His reign was marked by rebellion, political violence, and the execution of opponents who challenged his authority, most notoriously Archbishop Richard Scrope. To his enemies, Henry was a usurper, to his supporters, a necessary tyrant, but to history there had become something else entirely, a king undone not by revolt or war, but by the slow betrayal of his own body. For much of his early life, Henry appeared physically equal to the violence of his ambition. He rode, hunted, fought, and led armies in person. Chroniclers described him as active, capable, and resilient, a man shaped by movement rather than ceremony. Even early illness did not seem to diminish him. At around the age of 20, he contracted the pox, a disease that left no immediate lasting impairment. He recovered, returned to campaign, and continued to live as a medieval king was expected to live, on horseback, in armor, visible and commanding. But bodies remember what power prefers to ignore. Before we move forward, just one small interruption. Subscribe to the channel if this kind of history speaks to you. Comment below where you are watching from, and get comfortable because the next part is where everything tightens. By the opening years of the 15th century, something had begun to change. Henry's health no longer followed the simple pattern of injury and recovery. Instead, it entered a cycle of collapse and return, each episode leaving behind subtle damage that accumulated over time. The first unmistakable rupture came in 1405, when the king was suddenly struck by a violent condition of the skin. Contemporary accounts describe him crying out in agony, claiming that his flesh was burning. One chronicler speaks of his face erupting in red, inflamed patches, raw and painful enough to confine him to bed. The timing mattered. Only hours earlier, Henry had ordered the execution of Archbishop Scrope, an act that shocked even a society accustomed to political brutality. Almost immediately, rumors spread. Some believed divine punishment had struck the king down. Leprosy was whispered, not because the diagnosis was accurate, but because it carried moral weight. In medieval thought, leprosy marked the cursed ruler, the king whose body betrayed his soul. Modern historians are more cautious. The descriptions align more closely with a severe, recurring dermatological condition, possibly psoriasis, capable of flaring violently under stress, then retreating, only to return again. What matters is not the precise diagnosis, but the pattern that was beginning to assert itself. Henry collapsed, he suffered, and then, against expectation, he recovered. Within days, he was back in the saddle, leading troops against rebellion. To the court, it appeared that the danger had passed. The king still moved, he still ruled. The illusion of strength reasserted itself. Yet beneath that illusion, another problem had begun to take shape, one that could not be spoken of. Aloud, in April 1406, Henry wrote from Windsor to his council, explaining that an illness had suddenly affected us in our leg, causing such intense pain that his physicians forbade him from traveling. On the surface, the explanation was unremarkable. Kings suffered leg injuries, horses fell, campaigns were delayed, but the language itself was evasive, and medieval courts were experts in evasion. What Henry described as a problem of the leg was almost certainly not the leg at all. Many historians now believe this was a deliberate euphemism for a far more humiliating condition, a prolapsed rectum. The evidence is indirect but compelling. The pain was severe enough to immobilize him. Sitting would have been agonizing, riding nearly impossible. And most tellingly, the physician John of Ardern, one of the most experienced surgeons of the period, particularly in diseases of the anus and rectum, was summoned to treat the king. John of Ardern devised a treatment involving the application of a medicinal ointment directly to the affected area, intended to cause the protrusion to retract.
It was said to work. The king recovered sufficiently to resume his duties, but this was not a cure, it was containment. For a medieval king, this mattered enormously. Kings ruled in public. They sat in council. They rode before armies. They appeared before subjects. A condition that interfered with sitting, riding, or prolonged presence was not merely painful, it was politically destabilizing. And it was precisely the kind of affliction that could not be named without eroding the dignity of the crown. So it was displaced, translated, hidden behind safer language. Henry recovered again, and once again the court convinced itself that the crisis had been resolved, that the body had established its rhythm. In the years that followed, Henry's health became increasingly erratic. In 1408, at the age of 41, he collapsed suddenly, likely from a severe cardiovascular event. He survived, but only barely. 6 months later, he suffered a relapse so grave that his death was widely expected. On 21 January 1409, Henry made his will. He believed, as did those around him, that the end had arrived. It did not. This cycle, collapse, expectation of death, recovery, repeated itself for nearly 8 years. Henry lived, but he did not heal. Each survival left him weaker, more diminished. Chroniclers began to describe him as all sinews and bones, his body wasting away, his lower half growing thin and frail. Others claimed that his flesh seemed to be eaten away, that his internal organs appeared laid open and visible. Language that suggests not metaphor, but physical degeneration. The king lost most of his hair. His tomb effigy, depicting him bald and gaunt, is thought to be one of the most accurate likenesses we possess. By the early 1410s, he could no longer walk or ride without intense pain. He was carried in a litter, his body transported rather than commanded, alongside the rectal condition that had already humiliated him in silence. Henry now endured a cascade of other failures. His skin disease returned repeatedly.
Flaring and retreating, his body grew skeletal. His strength drained away. Chronicles spoke of festering of the flesh, of dehydration of the eyes, of organs failing from within. Whatever had begun as a localized problem had become systemic, and yet Henry refused to relinquish power. Others urged him to abdicate. His son, the future Henry V, increasingly took on the burden of governance. Law and order broke down in parts of the kingdom as the king's physical presence vanished from public life. That Henry clung to the crown through sheer force of will, ruling from within a body that no longer obeyed him. By the time of his death in 1413, at the age of 45, Henry V was a man consumed by chronic illness. The rectal prolapse that had first undermined his authority was not the sole cause of his decline, but it was among the most revealing. It exposed the fragile boundary between the king's public image and his private suffering. It forced the court to lie, to euphemize, to pretend, and it marked the beginning of a truth Henry could never escape, that a crown offers no protection when the body itself becomes the enemy. What truly distinguished Henry IV's suffering from that of other medieval rulers was not simply the number of ailments he endured, but the nature of the one his court could not openly acknowledge. Some illnesses could be framed as divine trials, others as battlefield injuries, others still as a natural toll of kingship. But one condition resisted all such narratives. It could not be sanctified, glorified, or publicly explained. It had to be hidden, translated into safer language, and managed in silence. That condition was the rectal prolapse. In April 1406, Henry wrote to his council from Windsor, explaining that an illness has suddenly affected us in our leg, causing such severe pain that his physicians had forbidden him to travel. Medieval kings did not casually describe intimate bodily failures, and certainly not those that compromised dignity.
Contemporaries understood this instinctively. A rectal prolapse, an involuntary protrusion of the rectum through the anal canal, was precisely the sort of condition that could not be spoken aloud in a sovereign. It implied loss of control, physical instability, and vulnerability in a part of the body most associated with shame. Modern clinical descriptions help explain why this condition would have been so debilitating. Rectal prolapse is chronic, often recurrent, and rarely resolves without intervention. It can cause constant pain, bleeding, discharge, and difficulty controlling bodily functions. Sitting becomes uncomfortable, then unbearable. Riding a horse, essential to medieval kingship, becomes nearly impossible. Prolonged standing, public ceremonies, or long councils turn into ordeals for a medieval king whose authority depended on visibility and physical presence. This was not a private inconvenience, it was a direct threat to rule. Medieval medicine had no surgical solution capable of permanently correcting rectoprolapse as modern procedures do. Treatments could reduce symptoms temporarily, ease pain, and reduce frequency, but they could not physically anchor the unstable organ.
Pain or delay recurrence, but they could not address the underlying causes: weakened connective tissue, chronic strain, circulatory impairment, or systemic disease. Even when the prolapse was manually reduced, recurrence was likely. Over time, episodes often became more frequent and more difficult to manage. This explains the pattern that would define the rest of Henry's reign. He recovered enough to resume governance. The crisis was declared resolved, but the condition did not vanish. It retreated, waited, and returned. Each recurrence would have brought renewed pain, renewed humiliation, and renewed efforts to contain it without admitting its existence. Was explained as general weakness, fatigue, or lingering illness. The truth remained confined to physicians and a small circle of attendants. The psychological burden of such a condition cannot be overstated. Medieval kingship was deeply performative, and authority was enacted through ritual. Maybe public appearance carried risk. Every extended ceremony threatened exposure, not of flesh, but of weakness. And yet Henry persisted. What makes his case particularly striking is not that he suffered from rectal prolapse, many people did, but that he survived with it for years while clinging to the crown. The condition became part of a broader constellation of illness, interacting with his other ailments rather than existing in isolation. Chronic straining infection, circulatory compromise, and systemic inflammation likely exacerbated one another. The prolapse was both symptom and aggravator, a localized manifestation of a body under increasing strain. Medical historians have noted that rectal prolapse often appears alongside other chronic conditions: skin disorders, circulatory disease, malnutrition, and connective tissue weakness. In Henry's case, these associations are difficult to ignore. His recurring skin disease flared and receded, his body wasted away. Henry consulted numerous physicians, many of them foreign, suggesting an increasingly desperate search for relief. Treatments intensified as his health deteriorated. Ointments, poultices, dietary regimens, and physical manipulations were applied according to the best medical reasoning available at the time. Some of these interventions may have reduced suffering, others likely worsened inflammation or delayed natural healing. There is no way to determine which. The question haunted contemporaries and continues to trouble historians. Did Henry survive because of medical care or in spite of it? What is certain is that he did not regain control over his hide. He learned instead to govern alongside its failure. The rectal prolapse did not kill him, but it altered how he ruled. By the late years of his reign, Henry's condition was no longer a single illness to be managed discreetly. It had become part of a systemic breakdown. Skin disease, skeletal wasting, impaired vision, chronic pain, and internal failure combined into what chroniclers described bluntly as festering of the flesh. The language was stark because the reality had become impossible to soften. And yet, even as his body failed him,
Henry refused to relinquish the crown. Others urged abdication. His son increasingly assumed the responsibilities of governance. Law and order faltered in parts of the kingdom as royal authority became less visible, but Henry remained king in name and will, ruling from a body that no longer allowed him to perform kingship in full. The illness that could not be named had done its work. It had exposed the limits of concealment. It had forced the court to lie repeatedly and carefully, and it had revealed a truth that no ritual could erase, that the authority of a king is only as stable as the body that must carry it. In the final phase of Henry's life, the question would no longer be whether his condition could be hidden, but whether his body could endure at all. By the middle years of his reign, it was no longer possible to speak of Henry IV's condition as a single illness. What had begun as episodic suffering, skin eruptions, sudden pain, periods of enforced rest, had hardened into a permanent state of fragility. The king was no longer recovering in any meaningful sense, he was enduring. The rectal prolapse that had first undermined his physical authority did not disappear, it receded, returned, and lingered, interacting with the broader collapse of his health, rather than standing apart from it. Chronic pain altered posture, limited movement weakened the body further, prolonged confinement disrupted circulation, infections found easy entry. What medieval physicians treated as separate complaints were in reality parts of a single unraveling. In 1408, Henry suffered one of the most dramatic crises of his life. Contemporary accounts described a sudden collapse so severe that for hours he was believed to be dead. He lost consciousness completely. His breathing was shallow. His attendants prepared for the worst. Some chroniclers suggest a seizure. Others imply a cardiovascular event, possibly a coronary thrombosis. The exact mechanism cannot be known. What mattered was the effect. The king, who had clung to survival through pain, now hovered at the edge of death itself, and once again he lived. This moment marked a turning point, not because Henry recovered fully, but because it shattered the remaining illusion of stability. The collapse was followed by months of extreme weakness. In January 1409, convinced that death was imminent, his court prepared for transition. Then, against expectation, his body rallied. This pattern would repeat itself relentlessly over the next several years. Chroniclers struggled to describe what they were witnessing. The reality is that too many years of weakness and various illnesses left him an invalid for the rest of his life. The rectal condition, once the most humiliating and carefully concealed of his ailments, now existed within a broader landscape of decay. His skin disease returned with increasing severity, erupting in raw, painful patches. His eyes grew dry and inflamed. His lower body weakened disproportionately, consistent with chronic circulatory impairment and prolonged immobility. The skeletal appearance noted by contemporaries was not the result of age, Henry was still in his early 40s, but of sustained physical collapse. After 1406, as Henry's health deteriorated, long-excluded gentry began to challenge royal authority openly. Royal ministers were attacked, crown lands were devastated. The king's physical inability to intervene decisively emboldened those who resented his rule. Power once concentrated in the person of the monarch began to diffuse and fracture. Increasingly, governance fell to Henry's son, Prince Henry, the future Henry V. Younger, healthier, and more mobile, he stepped into the vacuum created by his father's incapacity. Yet this transition was neither smooth nor uncontested. Henry V resisted abdication fiercely. Chroniclers note that only through an extraordinary act of will did he retain the crown to the end of his life. This stubborn refusal to relinquish power is inseparable from his physical condition. The rectal prolapse, the skin disease, the skeletal wasting, and the recurrent collapses all contributed to a single overwhelming reality. Henry could no longer embody kingship as it was meant to be performed. To abdicate would have been to admit that the body had won. So he endured. He ruled from a litter. He governed from bed. He issued commands through intermediaries. The authority of the crown persisted, but it was increasingly abstract, detached from the physical presence that had once sustained it. In this sense, Henry's reign entered a strange liminal phase. The king was alive, conscious, and determined, yet increasingly absent from the world he ruled. By the final years of his life, there was no longer a question of concealment. The illnesses that had once been euphemized now announced themselves openly. The court no longer pretended that Henry's condition was temporary. His body had become a site of continuous crisis. Survival itself was the achievement. When Henry collapsed for the last time in March 1213, reportedly within Westminster Abbey, it came not as a
shock, but as an exhaustion of possibility. He was 45 years old. His death was not the result of a single disease, but of cumulative failure. Skin, circulation, connective tissue, and internal organs, all compromised beyond recovery. Chroniclers no longer attempted to soften their descriptions. His flesh appeared eaten away, his skin raw and damaged, his internal organs seemingly visible beneath a frame stripped of resilience. These were not the metaphors of moral outrage alone, but the observations of men watching a body fail, slowly and publicly. The rectal prolapse that had first humiliated the king in silence years earlier now took its place within a much broader collapse. It remained a chronic, painful condition, likely recurring and increasingly difficult to manage as Henry's connective tissue weakened and his circulation deteriorated. But by this stage it was no longer unique. His skin disease flared repeatedly, disfiguring him and causing intense pain. His vision deteriorated, his strength evaporated. Whatever internal balance medieval physicians sought to restore no longer existed. Henry V's death came on 20 March 1413. According to tradition, he collapsed within Westminster Abbey, a setting heavy with symbolism. The king, who had seized the crown through force, died within the spiritual heart of the realm, his body finally giving way after years of resistance. He was 45 years old, a man who should have been in the prime of his rule, reduced instead to exhaustion. No single cause of death was recorded because none could capture the reality. Henry died of accumulated collapse, of skin disease that never healed, of circulatory failure that starved tissue and strength, of chronic pain that immobilized him, of a rectal condition that first undermined his dignity and later emerged into a broader disintegration of the body. His effigy, bald and gaunt, preserves this reality with unsettling honesty. Unlike the idealized monuments of many rulers, it depicts a king already stripped of illusion. The flesh is thin, the power is gone. In the aftermath of his death, the kingdom moved quickly. Henry V assumed the crown with energy and clarity. Law was restored, campaigns resumed. The contrast between father and son was immediate and striking. Where the elder Henry had ruled through endurance, the younger ruled through action. Yet the memory of Henry I's suffering lingered. For contemporaries, his body became a moral and political lesson. To some, his decline was divine punishment for usurpation and tyranny. To others, it was a tragic example of human vulnerability, a reminder that even kings are subject to the same physical laws as their subjects. For modern historians, his death offers something else, a rare, intimate glimpse into how chronic illness reshaped medieval power from the inside. The rectal prolapse that headlines this story was never the most dramatic aspect of Henry's decline, but it is the most revealing. It exposes the boundary medieval society could not cross, the place where language failed, where dignity had to be protected through silence, where power could no longer be performed, only asserted in name. In the end, Henry V's reign was not ended by rebellion in